Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do here in Portugal. Even though I'm still very little, but let's hope that I grow because I mean it's very frustrating because I don't know how is the intellectual sphere, the intellectual realm, the public intellectual realm, let's say in Canada, but in Portugal it is pretty much dominated by things like continental sociology that is derived from postmodernism.
Oh
So
yeah,
it is very, very, very frustrating to talk with people here, particularly about social phenomena.
yeah. Look, it's no different anywhere in the West. Uh, I call all these folks, since you mentioned postmodernists, intellectual terrorists. And again, I choose these terms precisely because by having very vivid terms, uh, it allows to truly capture the devastating effect that these people have on public discourse. So a terrorist is someone who causes mayhem, right? The 19 hijackers that brought down the twin towers were terrorists. Well, there are other forms of edifices, other types of buildings. They're called buildings of reason, right? We erected reason. And what postmodernists do is they come on their planes of bullshit and they squash, they destroy our commitment to reason, to science, to logic. Why does it upset me? Well, because think about, again, to use now a term from economics, right? The opportunity cost of students. How many thousands, hundreds of thousands of students have wasted their time, their careers, their academic trajectories, their parents' tuition, learning some of the biggest garbage that is human that could ever. I mean, astrology has more coherence than postmodernism. I mean, that is literally true. Okay, alchemy has more coherence than postmodernism. Yet, this is what we teach at our universities. This is why some of us who are in the public sphere despise all these movements, because we're truly committed to. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you study something in the humanities. And by the way, a lot of people think, oh, I'm against sociology or the humanities. Not at all, right? But there is a way to study all of these wonderful areas of human import while being committed to reason, right? The postmodernists don't do that. They throw that out. They're nihilists. They're intellectual anarchists. They're intellectual terrorists, and they need to be stopped. Now, I don't know if you've been following the grievance studies story. Have you followed that a lot? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. What do you think of it?
Well, I've got completely flabbergasted by it. I mean, I've already knew about the so-called thing that went about in the 90s, I think, right? And I've read his book that he wrote it with Eric Brickmont, I think,
Yeah,
where he exposed some of the methodology that postmodernists use.
factual nonsense was the title.
Yes, exactly, exactly that book. It's a great book, by the way. If people want to read it, it's a great book. But yeah, and I mean, you were saying, and I was thinking that many times I even tell people that for me personally, I consider postmodernism to be even more dangerous than the tribalistic and dogmatic parts of religion because postmodernism does something that religion usually doesn't. That is, it tries to completely undermine any innateness of the human mind. So
Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes I'll get emails from folks who, whenever you comment about anything, someone will write you and say, "Oh no, Professor Saad, you're misunderstanding. If only we did true socialism, then we would live in a utopia." The as actually I just posted a tweet earlier today, but I've done that many times. The 13 trillion examples where socialism has been tried and it led to devastating miseries were not manifestations of socialism, right? If only we can set up a true Islamic state, unlike the fake Islamic context of the past 1400 years, then we would all be free, right? I get the exact same thing. I even get it from otherwise supposedly sophisticated thinkers. There's one gentleman who's actually been on my show. I won't mention him as a courtesy to him, who seems like a perfectly rational guy, but he's somewhat very, very offended by my facile attacks on postmodernism. If only I understood postmodernism better, I would understand the beauty of the nuance. No, postmodernism is bullshit. I mean, yes, does it have little nuggets of banal truths? Yes, we are constrained at times by relativistic realities, right? You're always constrained by your unique personhood. Gee, what a brilliant insight. Okay, what next you've got for me, right? So no, postmodernism is not misunderstood. It was a movement that was started by several French charlatans, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, all of whom, now I don't have proof of this, I've proposed this theory to some of my colleagues who, some of them actually have known them, I think. My theory is they, through some sort of random process of generating gibberish, they actually realized that they could be invited to Princeton and have adoring people listen to them. And they said, it's a form of runaway selection. Let's see how far we could take this. In the deep recesses of their minds, when they went to bed at night and put their heads on the pillow, they knew that they were full of garbage. But there were too many rewards to be had, right? I mean, look at all the attention I'm getting from Princeton because of all this folk profundity that I'm saying. So I think I would love if at some point someone discovers a diary by these guys where they admit to this, because I genuinely don't believe that anyone could be so mentally deranged as to believe that anything coming out of postmodernism has any value.
Yes, but I think we already got some sort of a diary, like you say, because isn't there that anecdote that Daniel Dennett tells about, that I think it was Richard Rorty that told him about when one time when he was talking with Michel Foucault, that he asked him,
yes.
Right, you know what I'm
I know the story, yeah, go ahead, go tell it.
Yeah, and he was talking with Michel Foucault, Richard Rorty, and he asked him, I think, oh, Michel, why do you, when I talk with you, why are you so clear, but when you write, I can't understand half of what you're saying? And he told him, basically, paraphrasing, that he had in fact to do that, otherwise people wouldn't take him seriously in French society.
Exactly right. So I think it also comes, so this speaks to another point that I criticize about the social sciences in general, and certainly consumer behavior in particular, which of course has gotten some of my colleagues upset at me, although they are coming around. So in economics, economists have what's called physics envy, right? You know, I want to be thought of as a very serious mathematics guy. And therefore, if I'm going to really compete, now I'm speaking as though I'm one of those economists, right? If I really want to compete against the physicists, I've got to create endless bullshit math, which has nothing to do with any economic reality that anyone would want to model. But goddamn, it looks fancy if I've put a couple of extra lambdas and betas, right? And I'm speaking as someone who studied math. I mean, one of my PhD minors is in statistics, right? I have a degree in mathematics. My MBA, I did a mini thesis in operations research. So it's not as though, boo, I'm scared of math, right? But I could look at a lot of economic theorizing, and it is perfectly detached from this true study of economics, because they've become infatuated with the idea of appearing analytically rigorous. Well, I argue, and I'm going to come back to the postmodernists. Now, let's take this idea to a lot of the behavioral scientists, let's say consumer psychologists, right? So if you read a paper in some of the top journals in consumer psychology, not evolutionary psychology, in consumer psychology, it's unbelievably rigorous. It's a 2 by 3 by 4 factorial design. You may or may not know these terms. You do an ANCOVA, an ANOVA, mediational analysis, Lisrel model, path model, on and on. And then the final result is, after you do study 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7A, 7B, is that consumers who are happy at a restaurant are more likely to return to the restaurant. Holy shit, who could have thought of that? Wow, what a brilliant insight. But the methodology and the data analytic approach is so fancy, it's so scientific, that if it quacks like a duck, and walks like a duck, it must be a duck. Therefore, I must be a very rigorous scientist who belongs in the pantheon of scientists if I am a rigorous methodologist. Well, no, you don't have to do a 2x3x4 design and so on. Some of the most famous experiments in the behavioral sciences that have stood the test of time, you could explain them to a 10-year-old. They're incredibly simple, they're incredibly elegant, but they demonstrate something incredibly powerful about the human condition. Well, so now to speak of the postmodernists and Michel Foucault, what they're doing is exactly that, right? They have nothing of importance to say. But if I say, and I'm now going to put on my random POMO generator, the eigenvector of my praxis is a reflection of the transposed inner self. What does that mean? But goddamn, it sounds fancy. So it's all faux posing. It's all faux signaling, to go back to signaling theory. And if I could convince enough people that I'm sharp and smart and profound, I win the game.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I guess that you failed a little bit in that POMO sentence because you didn't refer to Freud. So
okay, just add the word ego in there. Somewhere in the line, add ego and we're good.
Or you simply stick Freud into it, even if it doesn't make sense. It goes well anyways.
You know, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's just talk a little bit about the concept, because I really think this is very important and we can't finish this interview without talking about it. The concept of nomological networks of cumulative evidence, because I guess that this is perhaps the thing that gives more strength to evolutionary psychology.
Right. So of all of the various attacks on evolutionary psychology, all of which piss me off, the one that by far angers me the most is the one that goes something like this. Evolutionary sciences in general, but certainly evolutionary psychology, is fake science, because all you guys do is, you know, you sit with scarves and you smoke pipes and you come up with post hoc just so stories, right? Now, the reason why this upsets me is, well, first of all, because the exact opposite is true. But secondly, it is the one that is often made by supposedly sophisticated academics. So I'm even more upset because it's not some random guy on the internet saying this, it's some of my colleagues. And so the way that I started trying to tackle this phenomenon is I started, and I really developed it through 25 years of trying to convince social scientists of what I was trying to convey to them, is what is the evidence that I need to provide you so that it becomes unassailable for you to argue against me? And it's not a literature review. It's not just, let me tell you about what the literature has found. That's not what it is. It's not a meta-analysis. It's a completely different epistemological way to think about how to construct an adaptive argument. Okay? Now, it turns out that someone had already done this in 1859. His name is Charles Darwin. When Charles Darwin was coming up with all of the evidence in support of natural selection, he took many decades to generate that knowledge. And that knowledge came from assiduous observations across many, many different domains, many different fields, many different sources of data, which when you put it all together, it became very difficult for anybody to argue against his theory, despite the fact that 150 plus years people have been trying to discredit him. Well, when I was then working, for example, on my 2007 book, and I had to go into different areas, show what the non-evolutionary approach was, and then demonstrate what the evolutionary lens adds to it or completes it or negates what was said, my mindset was always, what is the evidence that I need to provide you to convince you? And so then I started, so at that point, the term nomological networks I hadn't seen. Then I saw a paper by Schmidt and Pilcher in 2004 where they proposed this mechanism, which I had been independently doing for all my years. So then I then built on that and created what I now call the nomological networks of cumulative evidence, whereby I argue. So I'll give you maybe specific examples. And for those of you who are interested, I provide all of the information to what I'm going to say next in a paper that I published in 2017 in the journal Marketing Research on the epistemological method of EP. The epistemological method doesn't mean methodology, experiments or surveys or observation. It means the actual means of generating knowledge. How do you build arguments? So here's how it works. I could do, if you want, a few examples, because as you said, I truly think that this is probably, of all that we're talking about, the things that's, well, all of it I think is important, but nomological networks are truly important. And actually, it's
you can go ahead. I was just a bit worried, perhaps, about the time, because you gave me 75 minutes to this interview, and we already went through 1 hour and 8 minutes.
How about we go a bit longer? How's that?
Oh, okay, great.
But thank you for caring about the time. So the idea basically is that I want to provide you with evidence that hopefully makes it very difficult for you to counter-argue against me. All right, so let's suppose I want to demonstrate that toy preferences are biologically based. In other words, contrary to social constructivism, which basically argues that we become, our gender roles start off because our sexist parents teach little Johnny to play roughly with the blue truck and little Linda to play with nurturance with the pink doll. That's what starts the cascade of gender role specialization. That's what channels our eventual, sex-specific natures. Well, so I wanted to test this. Well, is it true? So are toy preferences innate, or at least do they have some biological signature, or is it all social construction? So now I have to start thinking. Okay, so this is. By the way, this nomological networks of cumulative evidence is going to be a central thing that I talk about in my next book, because I'm trying to convince that my approach is really the way that you tackle endless debates that are taking place in public discourse. So it's not just for evolutionists to use. It's really an epistemological tool you use to build arguments, strictly based on evidence. Okay, so here's how it works. So I want to convince you that toy preferences do have a biological signature. What kind of evidence should I get? Well, I could get data from children who are in the pre-socialization stage of their cognitive development, meaning that they haven't yet reached an age where they could be socialized, and I could explore to see whether their toy preferences are sex-specific. So is it the case that little boys will prefer certain types of toys and little girls other types? And the answer is yes. Now, if I stopped right here, so I'm building now this nomological network. This nomological network is like a puzzle. So if I stopped at only this data, it would already cast great doubt on the idea that is due to social construction, because I just refuted that idea. But I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to build a tsunami of evidence against you. So now I'm going to go on. I could get data from little girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is a hormonal endocrinological disorder that masculinizes little girls. It makes not only their morphology more masculine, but their behaviors more masculine. Well, I could take girls who suffer from CAH or girls who don't and see whether their toy preferences will shift. Well, guess what? Girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia have toy preferences that are more akin to that of boys. Now, this is looking pretty bad for the social constructivists, because now I've got hormonal signatures from a clinical population. But let's go on. I could get data from pediatric endocrinology. This is where they took using urine samples to measure testosterone levels of little children beginning at 7 days old until 6 months old, and they showed that their circulating levels of testosterone correlated with their toy preferences. That's not looking good. I could get data from funerary monuments, mausoleums. When people die, you build a mausoleum of them, from ancient Greece. and I could look at the depictions of children playing on these mausoleums, and they seem to show little boys playing with certain types of toys and little girls playing with other types. Bit by bit, and I've only given you a small part of my nomological network of cumulative evidence. Once I show you the whole thing, you know what your response is? I'm going to show it to you. You're done. Your mouth is open and you shut your mouth. Why? Because I let the data speak for itself. One other quick example. If I want to convince you that the waist to hip ratio preference that men have for women is the hourglass figure, how can I go about showing you that? Okay? Is it the case that we just come up with these post hoc stories, or might it be the case that we're actually very careful in building our adaptive arguments? Well, I'll use the nomological networks of cumulative evidence now and show you the extraordinary amount of evidence in support of that contention. Well, we know from just theoretically, sexual selection presumes that males and females will look for certain attributes in the opposing sex that confer reproductive advantage. This is true across sexually reproducing species. So the female crab will look at a bunch of males, each of whom will show his claw, and she will invariably pick the one that has the biggest claw for clear evolutionary reasons. There is no theoretical reason to presume that humans don't have their mating preferences arise out of the same mechanism. So the box of theoretical evidence is already there. Now we go to medical evidence. Well, there is medical evidence that shows that the nobility, the fertility, the health of women who have that hourglass figure is better. So now we've got the direct currency from evolution showing that if you have that preference, it leads to reproductive and health advantages. Now I could go to cultures from 50 different settings, right? I don't just run the study with 30 undergrads at Ohio State University. I go to the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon, and I go to the Hadza in Africa, and I go to the Bedouins in the Negev Desert, and I show that they all seem to have the exact same preference. I could do the studies on preference using paper and pencil. I could do brain imaging studies. I could show men different photos of women and see where the pleasure center of their brains is it more likely to become active if they see the girl with the hourglass figure. I could use eye tracking studies. I did a study where I looked at the female escorts online. How do they advertise, prostitutes online? How do they advertise their measurements? And the study was done using 48 different countries. And guess what? The average hourglass, the average figure was that of the hourglass. I could take congenitally blind men. This is not my study, regrettably. I wish it was me who had done it, because it's the most brilliant study ever. You take congenitally blind men. These are men who've never had the gift of sight. Therefore, they couldn't have been socialized by sexist cosmopolitan magazines, right? They couldn't have been socialized by Hollywood images. Guess what? Congenitally blind men prefer the hourglass figure via touch, okay? So I won't give you the rest of the stuff, but the data that I'm giving you is so overwhelming that you can't argue against it. This is why I go in front of an audience of 500 people, 95% of whom might be very hostile to evolutionary theory, and shh, I don't hear a single word from them. Why? Because the chip that's on my shoulder is not coming from personal arrogance. It's coming from the fact that I've got my nomological network protecting me. And this is what I'd like people to develop as a form of, if you like, mental hygiene. This is what I'm going to be talking about in my next book. Don't use emotions to build your arguments. Don't use political ideology. Don't use tribalism. Go where the data leads you. That's exactly what nomological networks do.
Yes, and now I'm going to tell you about two things. One of them is another anecdote that you can use on Twitter and Facebook if you want, because it's something that happened very recently here in Portugal. In fact, it was last Monday. But first of all, let me just tell you this. In fact, last February, I did a video for my channel that was perhaps the only one I did where I was the only person appearing there, because I was just just starting the channel and I couldn't get any guest for that week. So just to put the video out that week, I did a video to try to show people how through science we can demonstrate that sex differences are real. And inspired by you and inspired by, for example, people like Dr. Steven Pinker and the Blank Slate and Robert Sapolsky and others who also have this approach, I used precisely the approach of the cumulative, the nomological networks of cumulative evidence, and I referred to evolutionary psychology, personality psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroendocrinology, embryology, primatology, comparative psychology. So just to show people in a very simple way, because I didn't get too much into details, just to not bother people too much about it, but just to show people that we can completely build this scientific structure from the lower levels to the upper levels, and it is all, and now to borrow a word from E.O. Wilson, consilient, right?
I was going to exactly introduce that word, because one of the things that I've argued in all of my works, and if you go to the evolutionary basis of consumption, the last chapter where I talk about benefits of Darwinizing consumer research, one of the fundamental benefits, one of the most primary benefits is Consilience, which, by the way, in the paper where I introduce nomological networks of cumulative evidence and how it could benefit the behavioral sciences and so on, I talk about the building of consilient trees of knowledge, right? The idea is that there are unique epistemological benefits that are reaped via evolutionary thinking that you don't get anywhere else. Consilience is one of them. Consilience is a term that was reintroduced into the vernacular, if you'd like, by, as you said, E.O. Wilson. Everybody who's watching this show needs to read his book from the late 1990s, Consilience, which is basically unity of knowledge, right? The idea that things that appear disparate are connected, right? Well, now think how consilience is related to nomological networks of cumulative evidence, right? Because you have to think in a grand way, in a synthetic way, to be able to build these nomological networks, right? I'm not restricted to doing a literature search only within cognitive psychology or evolutionary psychology. On the contrary, I'm saying, what is the evidence that I can gather from all areas of human endeavor that could hopefully strengthen my position? It's a very different way of thinking. And that's why Charles Darwin is Charles Darwin, right? It's precisely because he had the natural instinct to say, I'm putting together a pretty dangerous idea here that's going to get a lot of people pissed off. I better be really careful about how I construct my argument. So he is the original nomological network guy, right? And so the more people who learn how to think this way, the fewer I'm not listening to you conversations we will have, because I will present my nomological network, you will present yours, and may the best man win.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let me tell you about the anecdote, because this last Monday it happened something that I guess that even you won't believe it. That is, we had a show here in Portugal in public television that is called Pros e Contras, that in English is something like pros and cons. So you put 3 people in each side debating something, debating a theme, and the theme of this last show was the Me Too movement. And so you had people defending the Me Too movement and people against, and there was this guy that I already knew about that was in the audience, and at a certain point they gave him the word, and he basically checks out all the boxes of someone who is intellectually, who suffers from intellectual degeneracy. So he's a postmodernist, he's a third wave feminist, he defends polyamory, he is for BDSM. I mean, his thesis, his master thesis was done influenced by the work of Michel Foucault, as we already talked about here. And he stood up and he said, oh, people have to know about this. We have these sort of micro violences going around in society where, for example, if people force children to give a kiss to their grandparents, this is something very little that accumulates over time, and that is why I arrive at my class and I have 40 students and all of them say that they can't deal, they can tell no to someone who wants to sexually abuse them.
Because originally they were forced to kiss their grandparent.
Yes, and you're being forcefully physically exposed to contact with other people.
I think I could beat that story because you threw the challenge that I made. There is a, I think, Australian sex expert who said that the changing of diapers of your children, in a sense, might be a form of aggression because they can't really give consent or something to that effect. So I think that's even worse because you're setting the aggression, the microaggression, even earlier than having to kiss your parents. So it's better to have your children wallow for 3, 4, 5 years in feces and urine, because after all, you wouldn't want to change them because they can't give consent. And look, this is just a breakdown of the human mind, right? I mean, and this is why, forgive me not to plug, but my next book currently now is tentatively titled The Parasitic Mind, but I'm not sure if that will be the final title. But that's because in what I'm doing in the book is arguing that in the same way that all sorts of parasites could infect various species' brains, causing them to behave in incredibly maladaptive ways, well, I expand that story to idea pathogens, right? In the same way that you could be parasitized by an actual physical brain worm, you could be parasitized by idea worms, by idea pathogens. And that causes people, like this guy that you just spoke about, to say things that are so breathtakingly removed from, common sense, folk psychology, right? Most people, whether they're smart or not, have a clear sense of how the world works, what's up, what's down, what's right, what's left, the most basic sort of Cartesian way of viewing the world. Well, what these parasites do is they completely rewire your circuitry. I mean, if not literally, metaphorically in your ability to think. Look, I've been going after the last few days Rachel McKinnon. This is a woman, and I put in quotes because she's a biological male, so simply saying that you are a woman doesn't make you a woman. Just like I can't say I'm a 4-year-old child because otherwise it's, trans ageism, right? There is a thing called my biological age, and there's no way for me to move myself away from that. So she won the world championship of cycling, where she crushed everybody else. And she was, I'm saying she because that she self-identifies as female. She won this, and she goes on Twitter, and she's very, very, bombastic about it, very grandiose. First time ever trans woman wins world championship, ever. So I then go after her, but politely. I actually say, hey, Professor, Dr. McKinnon, she's a professor somewhere, why don't you come on my show so we could discuss it? Because as someone who is so into trans rights, I mean, she so cares about rights. I wonder if the rights of all the women who lost to you, whether they matter. Or is it the case that all the, and here's some nomological, all the anatomical, physiological, biological, hormonal, and behavioral differences between men and women, do you think they put you at an advantage? Or is that all part of the transphobic patriarchy? Well, if this person were intellectually honest, well, first of all, she would look who I am. She would see the platform that I have. She'd say, well, my God, I would love to come on this guy's show because I want to demonstrate that my position is correct. This guy is offering a forum that's about 1,000 times bigger than anything that I could ever hope for. a million times bigger, and I could talk. What does she do? She blocks me, right? Why does she do that? Because she cannot withstand scrutiny. What's the lesson in this? Don't back away from battles because you think you're going to be attacked by the politically correct police. If everyone does their part in challenging the intellectual terrorists, we will win the battle of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Saad, can you give me much more time or not?
Let's do another 10 minutes. What do you think?
Okay. So let's just tackle one big question about psychology in general, and you already talked a little bit about your book, so I don't know if by the end you will want to refer to the same things you already referred to, but anyway. Okay, so I guess that recently I've been interacting with certain people that tried to undermine psychology as a scientific discipline and saying that it was not really scientific. And for example, they referred to this recent incident, about the marshmallow test, because I think last June someone published a study where they tried to replicate the marshmallow test originally from Walter Mischel right in the 70s, and they couldn't do it, at least exactly along those lines of 4-year-olds trying to avoid eating the marshmallow and then that predicting future behavior, future ability to delay gratification and things like that. But anyway, they picked up on that to try to undermine the entire field of psychology, saying that it wasn't really scientific. But what is funny about the fact is that they refer to the fact that Dr. Mischel wrote, I guess in 2013, in a book that I haven't read, but they refer to that what he was trying to achieve with that test was to try to devise ways to improve the capacity of delaying gratification in children, and that would have been the initial point, let's say. And then these people, at the same time that they are saying, oh, so you see, they try to create or to paint this as an innate mechanism, as some people being born with more or less ability to delay gratification, but in fact, again, it is completely society that influences people to more or less delay gratification. But what I think it's very interesting about this is that these same people that try to paint psychology as not being a real science are the ones that then pick up on a psychological concept like delaying gratification and make claims about it. And the problem is that by doing that, they're basically trying to do science in the field of psychology.
Well, cognitive consistency is not the forte of many of these ideologues, right? So you're demonstrating that they're being cognitively inconsistent. Of course, that goes with the fact that you're not being intellectually honest. But to answer your general point as to is psychology a science, it is breathtakingly idiotic to argue that. The brains that are creating science are called human. They reside in humans. If you want to study human behavior, the human predilection, human nature, it's called psychology. Now, the fact that oftentimes you have non-replicable findings, or you have suspicious findings, or you have shoddy research, doesn't say anything about whether psychology is a science. It basically says that at times scientists are not rigorous. At times scientists don't adhere to the principles of the scientific methods as much as they should do. But there's nothing inherent about the study of human behavior that is not scientific. As far as we know, the most complex organ that exists in the universe is our human mind. What do you propose that we use to study that human mind? It's called psychology in its various forms. Now, there are all sorts of idiots who use facile cues in deciding what is science or not. So, for example, and I actually went after, and I don't mean to imply that he's an idiot because he's a friend, although he was idiotic in this case. Ali Rizvi is a pathologist by training, who was someone who came on my show, and I like him a lot, but you know, people make mistakes, and in his case, at one point, he started attacking psychologists because, you know, it's fake science. Well, of course, psychologists are incredibly more scientists than a pathologist, right? Someone who studies medicine is not being trained to be a scientist, right? They're trained as a auto mechanic of the human body, right? Which is fine, and I need it, and it's a wonderful, it's a noble profession, but they're not being trained in the scientific method. So it's quite ironic that someone who is certainly not a scientist is actually, and by the way, the people that he criticized are some of the most sophisticated scientists. It was actually David Schmidt, it was Jeffrey Miller, it was another gentleman who was a social psychologist. I mean, really top guys. The only one that he said was a real scientist was a woman named Deborah So, who is a sexual neuroscientist. That to him sounded scientific because, you know, bruh, she wears a white lab coat when putting people through the fMRI. So I started trolling Ali hard, as I do when I get pissed off at someone, and he ran away. Why? Because I demonstrated what an idiot he was being. So if I use fMRI to study the neural activation patterns of a salmon, of a fish, I'm a scientist, I'm a zoologist. If I use fMRI to study the behavior of consumers in terms of how they react to fear-based advertising, bruh, is that really science? So studying a salmon is science. Studying a human consumer is not science. So it stems from people not understanding what it is to be a scientist. A scientist is simply someone who uses the scientific method, right? So you could be a historian and be a scientist. You could be a sociologist and be a scientist. And you could be a physicist and be a scientist. Now, the idea that because we disagree on a lot of stuff in a field, that means it's not scientific, is itself moronic. Physicists can't agree on whether the universe is expanding or contracting. Physicists can't agree on whether string theory is true or is a bunch of utter bullshit. So the idea that discussions, debates, the uncertainty of scientific knowledge within a field is a manifestation of it not being science is again idiotic. What upsets me is the arrogance with which people attack. So you get some random guy with an egg as his Twitter, right? Who writes to you and says, but you know, you're not a real scientist. I mean, you study human behavior. Now imagine someone who has spent 25 years, who did all that I did. So then I will usually troll that person, and oftentimes they'll shut down their Twitter account because they feel so embarrassed, right? Because I will write back and say, okay, guys, and I'll tag a lot of my famous scientist colleagues, hey, guys, the trick is up, the jig is up, it's time for us to pack it in. We've been found out to be frauds. Let's look for a new job. So imagine the arrogance of someone who comes after you after you've dedicated your life to the pursuit of knowledge and tells you you're not a real scientist because you don't wear a lab coat, right? Of course, psychology is a real science. Of course, sociology is a real science. The problem in these fields, unlike physics, although it's now coming to physics, is that the social sciences are more prone to being parasitized by ideology. You follow what I mean? So it's not that the epistemology of sociology or of psychology is any less scientific. It's that just by the nature of what you study, it's difficult to politicize the atomic number of uranium. But it's a lot easier to politicize things that we study in sociology or psychology. But that doesn't make it less scientific. It simply makes it that we have to be more careful, more assiduous in being honest scientists and only following the scientific method. Does that give you a very long-winded answer to your question?
Oh, it's perfect as it is. Okay, so Dr. Saad, we really have to go. So would you like to tell people perhaps when your new book will be out?
Right. So if all goes well, I should hopefully have it ready with my publisher by maybe end of the summer, and then depending on how quick the rest of the process, I would say I would love for it to be ready by early 2020. So in about a year and a few months, hopefully you can all be consuming the next book.
Oh, by the way, I guess you already know who's the person who has to receive a signed
Ah,
copy.
fair enough. Remind me that, and I know that you are not one who is shy of being persistent, so I'm sure I'll be receiving many emails. I do want to give you a shout out before we leave, because I think we mentioned this offline, and this is a strong compliment to you, but more importantly, it's something that should hopefully motivate other people. Uh, Mr. Lopez here, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
It's Lopez, but I guess that for people who speak English, it's a bit difficult
Okay,
to.
apologies for butchering your last name. You started this channel without any, a priori advantages. It's not as though you were a famous academic who could call upon all these other guests to come on your show. You decided that you wanted to get engaged. You wanted to create something that would contribute to the public discourse, and you set out. And I know maybe you're not ready to announce. You told me offline a guest who's coming later, maybe next year, who's a very famous person. You've had many other famous people on your show, and you did it from truly no privileged position. You're not a famous comedian or actor or scientist. You're just one guy who had the will to create a platform. That to me is a terribly important lesson to take away for everybody who's watching this. People often write to me and say, look, I want to get engaged, but I don't have your credentials. I don't have your platform. No, you don't need it. Joe Rogan is arguably more influential in terms of his platform than NBC, ABC, CBS, all of the mainstream, I mean, literally combined, right? When people go on his show, I mean, I could go on his show and walk anywhere and I will be stopped 50 times on the street because people have recognized me from Joe Rogan, right? Now, of course, Joe Rogan is a celebrity and so on, but he didn't have any direct way by which to connect to all of these very different people. But now anybody and everybody who wants to have a platform is more than pleased to appear on Joe Rogan. So whether it be Joe Rogan or you or anybody else, we all have the capacity, given today's tools, to contribute to the battle of ideas. So if you say, but I don't want to because I don't have a voice, then you are a coward and it's on you for not getting engaged. So look to your example and get engaged.
Okay, oh, I mean, I don't even know what to say now, but I guess, Dr. Saad, thank you a lot for the kind words, sir. And I mean, perhaps in the future, in the near future, I hope we could have another conversation because, in fact, I had another 200 trillion questions for you.
We'll do it again, I promise.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons KARIN, LIETZCKE, and BLANCHETTE, HELGE, LARSEN, GUERREIRO, CHANTEL, GELINAS, and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.